Okay, welcome to Coffee with Kyle. This is our podcast discussing issues in business and economics. I'm Kyle Murray, the Dean of the Laurier School of Business and Economics at Wilfrid Laurier University. My guest today is Dan Herman. Dan is a Toronto-based entrepreneur. He's been a policy advisor to government agencies on innovation and growth, including serving as the executive director for innovation policy for the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. He's also been a vice president of strategy and partnerships for early stage startups and co-founded the Center for Entrepreneurship and Economic Performance. Dan's currently building a content company that highlights the people and places shaping the future of technology and innovation. And Dan's a grad of Laurier. He's also a PhD from the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Okay, Dan, well, this is a timely topic, talking a bit about where Canada could diversify its trade, what's going on in the world today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've got my coffee as I usually do for these, and let's pour into it. So my first question, really, or first point is just, introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us a bit about your journey and what got you here.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to join you to talk about something that is timely, perhaps unfortunately very timely, given the current zeitgeist and the current news cycle. But I won't say too much about my background because you did a great job of explaining where I've come to this issue from. But 20 odd years ago, I was a Laurier BBA student. I started in economics and then switched over to the business program. I got really interested in development and in how do countries and how do economies develop. Spent some time in Africa, spent some time working in governments around the world. And then that turned into a master's degree. And then every time I finished, I said, okay, that's no more classroom. But then somehow it ended up back in the classroom. So I did my PhD focused on innovation policy and really the role of government in stimulating their domestic innovation economies. And then, as you noted, spent some time working in government, helping the Canadian government on innovation and growth. I was the special advisor for the government of Ontario on intellectual property and the creation of a new intellectual property agency. And kind of across that journey, I've spent half my life working with government and half my life either being an entrepreneur and pleading to government for help. And so I've got a relatively multifaceted perspective on some of the challenges we face today. And this issue of where Canada shows up or how we show up in the economy and the global economy, this really started to, I guess, bug me really when I was in Ottawa. And my office in Ottawa was a bit of the front door during the creation of the Innovation and Skills Plan in 2016 and 2017. It was the front door on requests on whether it was startup organizations, venture capitalists, different industry associations, come and say, here's what we need and here's what we want. And eventually I started hearing the same story. And so I'd ask them, I was like, well, where do you sell? Like, why do you need more from me? Where do you sell? And the answer was always the same. It was always the United States. And so, okay, I get it. Gravity forces us to a certain degree towards our southern border and towards, what has been post-World War II, not just the biggest, but for a time, the fastest growing economy. So it makes sense. But we've known for a long time that the trajectories of, the United States economy, of some of the mature industrial economies in the West/North aren't that robust. And so I'd ask these entrepreneurs or these investors, I'd say, well, what about the rest of the world? And unfortunately, often I'd get met with some quizzical stares about that. And so that's really where I started to dig in a few years ago on where should we be playing. And, the old Wayne Gretzky adage, it's not about being where the puck is, but it's about, trying to figure out where should we be.
Yeah, that's a great way to end your introduction there because one of the things I've been joking about with some colleagues lately is talking about international trade, tariffs, international affairs, governance, the kinds of things that you've studied, spent a career on, historically weren't very topical because we had this relationship with the U.S. Canada wasn't really a big player internationally, and all of a sudden, people like you are the rock stars because we all want to better understand where we fit in the world. And a lot has happened in the last 5 years. We've had a pandemic, There's now, a land war in Europe. We've seen some of these climate change effects and now massive disruption in global economic relationships. And in particularly that last one, I think, is on everybody's mind right now. What do you make of that? What do you make of where we are today, and maybe even a little bit of how we got here?
Yeah, and your earlier comment, like I was a really boring guy at dinner parties for a while because when I wanted to talk about trade protectionism, which is a topic I was working on kind of 15 years ago, no one wanted to, right? It was a topic that was it was wonkish and it was on the fringes. But I think even back then, post the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we started to see this uptick in kind of really, nationalist economic policies of countries that were trying to figure out how to work around the World Trade Organization, try to work around bilateral or regional trade agreements to figure out how to privilege their domestic sectors and their domestic businesses. But at the time, it wasn't it wasn't a big issue. And even when I went to Ottawa and we try to do certain things and they'd say, no, you can't do that because that's protectionist. But no one really cared about it. It was this fringe issue. And so for better or worse, now it's no longer a fringe issue. And now, the Trump government's decision to implement, pretty huge tariffs on essentially every place, every economy around on the earth has put this at the top of the agenda for policymakers and for business owners and for everyone who ultimately is a stakeholder to an economy. And the challenge that in Canada we face more acutely than other places is that our boat is really tightly tied to the American consumer market. And so for essentially 50 years, 75% thereabouts of our exports have gone directly to the United States. And so while it always made sense because they had a fast growing economy, they were the world's largest consumer market for a long time, and they were right there, like they're right there. And so it was always really easy for us to justify that amount of trade. But it's also been well known for a long time that when you have 3/4 of your export economy tied to one place, that's also a heck of a risk. And that risk we've always punted. We always said, well, yeah, but nothing will ever happen to put us in jeopardy. And so our efforts around trade diversification, in my opinion, never took off because we never really thought that this would happen. And lo and behold, though, here we are where it is happening, and we're staring at an export picture where 75% of our exports go to one place. Our next largest trade market for exports is the European Union, that across 27 countries represents 4.5% of our net exports. So that gulf between 75 and 4.5 is pretty huge, and it's part and parcel of why I won't use the term, I don't think anyone's panicking, but I think everyone's very, very quickly trying to figure out, okay, how do we change this in a heck of a hurry?
Yeah, I mean, who knows what'll happen next? But right now, as we're talking, we look at the stock markets around the world, really falling fairly steeply. I think some people are starting to talk about, panic of a sort, and what do we do, and how do we manage the current context? I mean, it's easy in hindsight to say, for all of us to say, oh, we should have diversified. But as you just explained, it was just so easy. We had the biggest and in many ways, best performing consumer market in the world right beside us. They wanted what we were selling. They're friendly. They're a lot like us. We speak the same language. I mean, it's so easy and so comfortable to do that kind of trade. It's not that surprising we got into it. But now, yeah, we're in a little bit different world. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is I know you've had experience in some really interesting places globally and learned a little about some other opportunities and other ways of approaching these problems. So I'd like to hear a little of your thoughts on that. And just before you jump in, I should say, we didn't really catch this at the beginning, but post PhD and post advising governments and being involved in startup, part of what's taking you around the world is you're actually a documentary filmmaker as well now, right? You've added that to your CV.
Yeah, and that kind of is related to this other world because when I was in government and when I advised governments, often the input was a big thick research report. And I remember, I don't know, it was more than a decade ago, I asked one of my clients in the public sector, I said, hey, like, you pay us X dollars, we do all this work for you, but I don't see any result of this. What's going on? And this individual was a deputy minister in an unnamed jurisdiction, opened up a filing cabinet and said, well, there's your work, and dusted it off. I said, wow, like this is pretty depressing that all this effort that we did as consultants, as advisors, really didn't get many eyeballs. And so what I realized is that, sure, like there's a whole world for research and for inputs, but that really to change the dial on how people think, there's different modes of that. And that, we live in a world today of kind of visual video content. And so after that conversation and after my time in Ottawa, where I started to realize that we had this real problem in terms of our vision of the rest of the world, I threw out a crazy idea one day at a party with someone I knew relatively well. And I said, if we want to tackle this issue, we need to change the way people, and just general people, the way students, the way business owners, the way people who walk, our neighbors think about the world. And I said, we should create a TV show about this. And we all laughed and said, haha, that's funny. And then a couple of weeks later, someone phoned back and said, are you serious about this? And so I very quickly sketched out what I thought was, a relatively decent idea of a documentary series about places around the world that were both really established places around technology, around the new economy, but also the places that we really should find out about. And that if you look at, the list of the top 20 growing economies on the earth, they're not in North America, they're not in Europe, they're in Africa, they're in Asia, and they're in Latin America. And so I threw out this idea and, lo and behold, someone wrote a check and we were on the road for about a year and a half filming in 18 countries around the world, 18 cities that we visited to figure out kind of what was the magic around what they were building. And while each city, each country has a very unique story, what you started to see very quickly was that we're not that special. And that, the places that we have commonly thought were, our core markets, they're not that special. That there's a consuming class, there's a creative class, there's a creating class in places that, 10, 20, 30 years ago, we've thought of as poor or developing or, emerging, but they've arrived. And our future is really about, can we find a way to take some of our economic activity and transfer it to these places, the Indonesias, the Vietnams, the Colombias, the Chiles, the Kenyas, the Senegals, that are really at the top now of the chart on growth, on economic growth. So, I like to joke, whenever someone thinks of a crazy idea and you think, no one will listen, well, maybe sometimes they do.
Yeah, I mean, on a much smaller scale, that sounds a lot like how I got into this podcasting. It's just sort of saying, maybe that's something we should do once. And then it turns out that not only do we have a lot of access through alumni and others to a lot of really great guests like yourself, but there are people who want to listen to some of these talks and hear from a university in a form that's not just academic papers or articles or those kinds of things. So I completely agree with what you're saying is that basic research is really important and it's what we're good at. But it's also important for us to try and embrace some of these new ways of getting the message out. Which kind of leads me to my next question for you. So you've seen these things, I think you said 18 countries around the world, some of these non-traditional markets for Canada to be a trading partner with or to learn from. And so if you were to try to distill some of that into advice, what would you tell businesses, maybe policymakers, what could they learn from your experience, and what should they be doing to take advantage of some of the opportunities that exist in those non-traditional markets?
It's a great question, and I actually give a little bit of a break to the policy side or to the government on this issue of diversification, because I think they've done a really good job of setting up programs and support. When I left the government, I joined a startup, and we had a product market fit that aligned really well in aging economies that had kind of high rates of technological or mobile adoption. And so we looked at Asia, several East Asian countries. I phoned the Trade Commissioner Service, and I was blown away by the service I was offered. And as I chatted with them about what we were up to, what they could bring to us, and when I thought back to my time in Ottawa, what I realized is we actually have a demand problem. We don't have a supply of government support problem, in my opinion. We have a demand from industry, from business owners who just don't really know what is out there. And it's the old adage of, if you don't know what you don't know. And so this is where we need to help business owners. We need to help students. We need to help parents kind of break through what is sometimes a scary unknown. Right. And you mentioned it earlier that the US market, the US, the UK, Australia, France, these have been really easy markets for us to do business in. Culture is very similar. Language is either the same or very similar. There's just a long-term relationship has been built here, which means that if you were a university student thinking of going on exchange, well, going to London or going to Paris, it's a really easy and simple path. Same thing if you're a business owner and you want to think of a new market. Well, going on a trade mission to any of those countries or to Germany, Australia, it's really easy. But once we say, okay, well, let's go to Vietnam, you shake people at their core and they say, well, wait a minute, I don't know anything about this. And so then they think about what they know, and in particular, in some of the fastest growing economies in the world, well, they're fast growing because 10 years ago, these places from a per capita GDP standpoint were exceptionally or far behind where we are. And so people's mindsets are often still stuck back there. And so we need to bring them along a path very quickly. We need to bring them along that path quickly to see what these places are in actuality today, that they are huge and growing middle classes, consumer markets. They're both creators of technology that will compete with us. So we should actually know about them from a competition lens. We should know about them from a talent perspective, because today, you look at the resources and infrastructure that exist around research and technology around the world. It's relatively democratized, and the ability to build technology products, in particular software, is essentially totally democratized. It's essentially ubiquitous because of the availability of online resources to learn. And so that both the buy side and the sell side, we should be learning about these places. But we need to give them something. We need to kind of cheat the process because we haven't been exposed. And so I always say to, when business owners ask me, like, what do I do? And it's like, okay, let's figure out, where does your product fit? What are the 3 markets that might have a product market fit for you? And then, okay, well, how do we show them that this isn't scary, right? That the barriers that, for better or worse, from potentially a moral point of view, English is like, we've got the biggest advantage of the world, that you can show up in Ho Chi Minh, you can show up in Santiago, or you can show up in Lagos, and you'll speak English. And like, the language of business has become English. And so that's already one tick off the kind of the scary list or the challenge list. And then the second, and this really is about, our technology and innovation communities. The language around technology, the language around startups, is ultimately a global language, right? It's I've got a colleague, Ilya Brodsky, who runs a company called Van Hack. It's a recruitment company. He says, code doesn't have an accent, right? It's ultimately, when you're coding, it's the same language all around the world. And I think that's really, we have to update our learning around that and just get out and figure out where the 2-3 places that this might work, and just go. And we've got to be uncomfortable, and we've got to be willing to be uncomfortable, because I think once we try that, we'll realize the world's not a scary place, that business is business, and but we have to invest in it, and we've got to not just go once, but we've got to go back and kind of build some networks, build connections, and show people that we have a product to sell and that we're trusted partners in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that a lot of good advice there. I really like this idea of becoming more uncomfortable. I think, I was saying that it's just comfortable and easy to do what we've been doing for so long. And for most of my life, most of our lives, Canada's been a really comfortable place to be, even when maybe other parts of the world had more challenges. And we still have this really great infrastructure and system, like you said, post-secondary education, K to 12 education systems, healthcare that are all still pretty solid. They give us a real advantage, and we speak English, which makes it easier to reach out into the world. And I think one of the other interesting things that you mentioned was we often talk about these international relationships as can we sell our product into these markets? But as we go through a new world where we have these trade barriers, we might also think about what can we buy from some of these markets? What sort of vendors are there that can fill some of the holes we might now have in our supply chain, and who we can partner with as well. So it's not just selling our products into the market, but it's really integrating or being part of those markets that we hadn't thought of before. I think that's
Oh,
fascinating.
absolutely. And it's, in part, this isn't, there's always waves of change that run through the global economy. And, if you think post-World War II, we had, maybe the Marshall Plan was the first wave right after the war. The second was the rise of the East Asian tigers, right? From, call it the mid 60s to the early 80s of the Singapores, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and this huge wave of economic development that we really kind of watched from the outside. And we've got some connections into those economies, of course, but we're not very engaged. The second wave or third was China, and China's kind of post 1980, post Deng Xiaoping's entry into the formal world economy in a sense, and then after 2000 through the WTO, and now we have this third wave where everyone else is catching up. And to your point, it's not just about selling. Like there's a huge sell side opportunity that we need to capture that we're behind in engaging with, but I don't think it's too late. But as you note, it's also just a whole supply chain that who's going to build the EVs on our street? It might be Tesla, but these days we might think differently about that. And so, the market for whether it's infrastructure, whether it's automobiles, whether it's software, whether it's semiconductors, those supply chains, we need to be a part of those. And increasingly, those are outside of the core places where we do business.
Yeah, very interesting. So I'm thinking about this world and thinking about my role as dean of a business school and a school of economics. And what advice do you give to younger people or our students who are just going to graduate and go out into this new world? How do you get them to think more globally, to get a little bit uncomfortable?
I think it's easy to say what I'm going to say. It's sometimes harder to do it, but you just have to go see it. I remember when I was a Laurier student in 2001, I took that summer of my third year. I had bartended at the Turret, so I'd saved up a little bit of money. And I went and spent 4 months in China in 2001. And it was absolutely just, earth shattering in a positive sense that I saw where the future was. And so I think for students today, you need to go and see where the puck is going to be. And the puck is not going to be in the United States. The puck is likely not going to be in, very mature industrial economies in Europe where demographics are somewhat destiny. And if you believe that adage that demography is destiny, then our usual trade partners are not where the puck is going to be. And so to go spend time in places in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, where the puck is more likely going to be, where 99% of population growth will be in emerging markets and developing economies. Those same economies will grow 2.5 times faster than today's industrial economies. So the puck, we've got a pretty good idea of where the puck is going to be. And so for a student today, for a new grad today, I think investing in going to engage in those places, going to see what it's like, going to be uncomfortable a little bit, but also I think the result, I'm always willing to bet, that the result is that they'll see that these places are actually very similar, that people are similar, that all the cultural uniqueness of a place, which is phenomenal, business is business, and we've got to take advantage of that fact, because what we're doing and what we've done, if we keep doing it, is unlikely going to keep Canada as the great place that you and I know it for.
Fantastic. That's a great place to wrap up our conversation today, Dan. Thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, this has been fun. Thank you, Kyle.